Well, good morning. My name is Sheila Gilheany from Alcohol Action Ireland. I'm very pleased to welcome you here this morning to our webinar where we're having a discussion on the role of men's drinking and domestic violence. I'm conscious that we have a number of people who are still coming in, but I like to kind of at least get some of the formalities out of the way so people know that, that when the speakers come in, that most of our attendees will be here. This particular webinar has been organised at this time of the year because we're also marking 16 days of activism around gender-based violence. So we are talking, I suppose, mainly this morning about, men's drinking, but we are aware, of course, that there are issues around women's drinking and the impacts that can be in that, but we're particularly marking this this morning. I wanted just to give a little bit of context as well about why Alcohol Action Ireland is looking at this. About 7 years ago, we began an initiative that we called Silent Voices. And Silent Voices looks to, I suppose, raise issues in relation to children growing up with alcohol harm in the home, and the problem of, parental problem alcohol use. Something that is very, very widespread here in Ireland. A recent survey actually from Maynooth University would have found that a quarter of the adult population in Ireland, that's 1 million adults, grew up with alcohol harm in the home. And yet this is a very hidden aspect of alcohol harm, something that is difficult sometimes to talk about. Sometimes the silence begins in the home, but it's definitely compounded with a society view that finds it a difficult subject, to look at. But as part of that work, we have been looking at, issues that, people with lived experience would raise with us, through stories that are shared with us. And I will say that one of the things that's often talked about has been the experience of domestic violence and growing up with alcohol and domestic violence in the home. So it's in that context that we're here, and I hope we'll have a kind of a fruitful discussion about this morning. At the outset, I really do want to say that Alcohol Action Ireland does not say that alcohol causes or is in any way might be considered an excuse or an explanation for domestic violence. We would say, and we would see this, and other evidence would point to this, that it's a contributing factor, an exacerbating factor, something that's likely to increase the frequency and increase the severity of violence. So our main speakers, and I'm so pleased actually to be able to welcome them here this morning, Anne-Marie Laslett and Ingrid Wilson, are joint authors, along with a number of others, with a major review which they would have carried out, looking at the research in and around the space of men's drinking and harms to women and to children. So very shortly I'll be handing over to them, to talk us through that the research and what they have found. I'm very interested as well because they're joining us. One is Anne-Marie is joining us from Australia, Ingrid is joining us from Singapore. But Australia for us is actually often of interest in alcohol issues. In a number of different areas. We see it in work that has been done there around FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, but we also see it in terms of reviews that are taking place about licensing hours and licensing regulations, with a view towards trying to reduce some aspects of domestic violence. So we're always interested in just trying to learn from what's happening in other countries. They'll be presenting for best part of an hour between them, and then we're joined actually with our panel on discussion, and I'll introduce them properly when we come to that. But they include Allison Graham, who's CEO of Saoirse Domestic Violence Services, Dr. Michelle Walsh, who's the CEO of Move Ireland, Men Overcoming Violence, and academic, feminist, activist and patron of AAI Silent Voices initiative, Ailbhe Smyth, will be joining us. You're very welcome, as for the audience, to join in the conversation by putting questions into the chat, and we'll do our very best to get to as many as we can during the session. So with all of that, I think we're just about ready to go, and I'm going to be handing over firstly to Professor Anne-Marie Laslett. Anne-Marie comes with a wealth of experience and knowledge in this area. She's Professor at National Health and Medical Research Council, emerging leader at the Centre for Alcohol Policy Research at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. Anne-Marie has worked in public health on alcohol and drug epidemiology for over 2 decades, and she is very well known, as I say, for her research on alcohol harm to others, particularly in relation to harm to women and children. Um, uh, there's quite a line of many other things that we have, but I'll hand over to you, Anne-Marie, and I'd say I'll let you just speak for yourself at this stage. So thanks very much for joining us.
Just share screen again. That work? No, I'm not in presenter mode yet.
That's
Is that
so we're just seeing your notes as well coming up, but
what's happened again? Sorry about that.
it's not the end of the world. There, perfect.
Yeah, I'll just
You
stop
have
it.
Perfect. There it is. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Sheila. It's lovely to join you from Melbourne, also known as NAM in Australia, and I really would like to acknowledge the whole team at the Centre for Alcohol Policy Research, where I work, who have contributed to the work that we've produced, as well as the whole international team that is a delight to work with, including Ingrid and many others, including Siri. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and particularly any First Nations people who are online today. I also want to acknowledge people who have lived experience. We have so much to learn from them. And if anyone does need to reach out, I saw that Allison has put online some support services. If anything does trigger anything for you, please make use of those. And we hope that you're okay. So we a wonderful team of researchers from South Africa, the US, Australia, Portugal, Norway, UK, Egypt, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Singapore. Recently released what we called it's a global policy briefing, The Harms to Women and Children from Men's Alcohol Use. It's an evidence review and directions for policy. And as part of that brief, we were funded by the World Health Organization via Thai Health to review the harm to children from men's drinking, the harm to women from men's alcohol use, and potential policy directions to reduce harms to women and children from men's alcohol consumption. So by way of background, greater proportions of men drink than women across the globe, and in every country, men drink more than women. So this graph, for example, shows that on this y-axis, how much men drink, and then on the x-axis, how much women drink. So just for example, men drink 3 times as much as women do in Ireland. It's also similar in Australia, although overall we drink a little less. And in Singapore, again, the population drinks less, but we still see, real gender differences in the way that that men and women drink. And so men drink a lot across the world, across most of the countries that we live in, and we know that harm to children from men's alcohol use can include being physically hurt, verbally or emotionally abused, being neglected or exposed to intimate partner violence or domestic violence or family violence because of others drinking. Parents and caregivers can compromise child rearing. Their drinking can compromise child rearing. It can influence adolescent heavy alcohol use, can result in poorer child social and educational outcomes, mental and physical ill health and injury, maltreatment, and family violence. Family life can be disrupted, sometimes with parent-child dynamics reversed and child protection system involvement. So we have done a lot of work studying the harms that families have experienced, and when we ask them about how their children have been affected, 4 to 14% of families report some harm from others drinking in the past year. So, and they report different types of alcohol-related harms to children. For example, in Ireland, we can see here that 2.8% of families reported that children experienced physical harm because of someone else's drinking in the last year. Around 9% reported children were verbally abused, and around 5% reported that they experienced or they witnessed serious violence in the home, or that they were left unsupervised. So across the globe, we can model this to estimate that millions of children have been affected by others' drinking. When we ask people, were children affected in these ways by others' drinking in the last year? So, however, we know women and children have long been affected by others' drinking, and with most of this drinking being undertaken by men. But research has not always analysed gender in terms of harm to children. Our work in the previous slide actually didn't either. So gender is often not measured in terms of the gender of the child, or in the terms of the gender of the person harmed, or sometimes the person held responsible. So children and parents can kind of hide gender. And then we also know that the gendered social and cultural expectations of parenthood mean that sometimes often parent is synonymous with mother. But we did look in this study at who, when we asked respondents overall in the study, whose drinking they were talking about when they were talking about the person who had most affected them, or whose drinking had most affected them. 71% of respondents reported that it was a man who had affected them, whose alcohol use had harmed them. And they reported that on average, this person was drinking 5 or more drinks 3 or 4 times a week. And when they drank heavily, they consumed 13 or more drinks. So they're quite heavy drinkers. However, research is often more concerned with the drinking behaviours of women and mothers. So this study here, which was released recently, shows that currently, particularly in sociological and behavioural sciences, single gender studies have more commonly focused on women's drinking patterns than men's. So this red line here shows how many papers were written about women's drinking. This blue line shows the number that were written about men's drinking. Yet we know men actually experience significantly more health-related harms than women. So, while there are real issues around the feminisation of alcohol marketing and patronising ways in which women are addressed, we also know that there are, concerns around women's drinking in terms of they may not be receiving the treatment that they need, or there are a range of problems. But again, that's not the topic of today. But what I was trying to get at here was, I think there is a focus on women's drinking, and I think it's right to question that focus, because men do a lot more drinking than women, and when they do, they cause more harm. So yes, as Cass Hopkins said, while women's drinking is often scrutinised, men's heavy drinking and its physical, psychological, social and financial impacts on children and families are often overlooked. So back to the briefing that we have been working on. The first paper, or the first review, looked at harm to children from men's alcohol use, and we identified 4 broad topics: relationships and family, violence and maltreatment, health and wellbeing, and social and educational outcomes for children that were affected by men's drinking. Some reviews included discussions of economic disadvantage and gender inequality, norms and social and gender inequitable norms, and social and cultural norms. But we kind of did an analysis of what these harms were showing. What was the situation around the harms to children from men's drinking? And in thinking this through and collating our findings, we came up with this model where in the centre we have the drinking man, and on the left in green we have the potential actions that were associated with men's drinking. And on the right we have, in purple, we have the outcomes or the impacts of these actions for children. So we can sort of, if you look at the green side, men's drinking disrupted family life, caused conflict, aggression and violence, meant that they were unavailable and did not prioritise children's needs, and often spent money on alcohol and were sometimes unemployed because of their drinking. And then we turn to the impacts on women and children. And the first topic we looked at was, relationships and families. And so among these reviews, we found that heavy drinking by men in the family was associated with a number of negative outcomes in the family context. Marital discord, conflict, family cohesion was strained. One review identified that the burden that the family faces due to men not fulfilling their family duties, which again was sometimes involved men not being there to support the family and being or to provide for the family. And we also found that the father's alcohol consumption was negatively associated with the parental bonding between the father and the child. So children of heavy drinking fathers were significantly less likely to feel emotionally close to their father, either due to the impact of heavy alcohol consumption upon the father's behaviour, or because it led to conflict within the home or estrangement. Next, we sort of turn to the second purple oval, or the little hammer there, which looks at violence and maltreatment and shows that children may be the direct targets of violence, or they may witness violence against another family member or members of the family. And in both situations, child maltreatment and intimate partner violence, these victimise children, but they're kind of researched as distinct forms of family violence, yet importantly, children's exposure to intimate partner violence is kind of recognised as a separate entity in itself. So there's both direct harms to the child as well as those that they experience when they see other people being victimised. So both heavy alcohol consumption and intimate partner violence can create a toxic family environment in which the safety of the children can be compromised. And, one review on child maltreatment found that men's drinking was associated with harsher punishment of children as well. The next, in this we looked at mental and physical health outcomes for children and found that men's drinking was linked with internalising behaviours among children, such as depression and anxiety. Some of these include aggressive behaviour of children, hyperactivity, conduct difficulties and disruptive disorders. Other negative health outcomes include child injury, increased days of hospitalisation, poor diet, low weight or poor weight gain, and dental problems. And some reviews also found that fathers drinking may have implications for adult children late in life, such as difficulties with trust and with their relationships more generally. And finally, we have the social and educational impacts for children, which were less widely discussed, but fathers' alcohol consumption was linked to educational challenges such as school-related behaviour problems, lower educational attainment, attendance problems, and school behavioural problems of children were sometimes associated with paternal heavy drinking, including truancy and absenteeism, suspensions, attention difficulties and conduct problems. And so disruptive family environments were also linked with, adverse schooling outcomes for children. So, however, all of these harms happen within the context, within different contexts, and some of the reviews brought up demonstrated the context which exacerbated problems associated with men's drinking. So particularly economic disadvantage was important, particularly in low and middle income countries. High rates of poverty in lower and higher income countries were associated with worsened individual and family consequences. So when these problems intersect with men's drinking, we can see that socioeconomic related problems were more prevalent and could be related to persistent unemployment, to economic instability, poor education or lower education, homelessness, and so these together form even more negative outcomes for children. Next, I think we look. It's fundamentally important to consider the cultural patriarchal and gender norms, different hegemonic masculinities. While patriarchal and gender norms were only discussed explicitly in 2 of the reviews that we looked at, those reviews did find that hegemonic norms were associated with increased violence in the household, where children might be the direct victim of violent behaviour or exposed to intimate partner violence. And in a review of lower and middle income countries, specific cultural norms related to gendered power dynamics and masculinities were identified. So the authors of that review found that patriarchal norms that put men in a position of power were associated with higher levels of men's alcohol consumption and their rights to drink, and this led to alcohol-related consequences for children and families. And finally, we have intimate partner violence, and Ingrid will cover this in more detail, but some reviews were situated within an intimate partner violence context, where alcohol was a factor within the broader context of intimate partner violence. And mostly these reviews identified male perpetrated intimate partner violence towards women, but children were rarely the subject of those reviews. They were just listed as potentially affected due to exposure to these violent situations, but their experiences were a little underplayed. So we developed this model further to include contexts and intersecting oppressions and structural determinants of harm. So thus we have men's actions and outcomes for women and children located within this broader context, with factors such as the social determinants of health, gender inequalities, and other oppressions against LGBTQI plus groups or against First Nations peoples intersect to cause even greater harm to children when men drink. I think I've mentioned these, but just thinking about the reviews that in this review that we were asked to undertake, these contexts arose numerous times: poverty, patriarchal norms, cultural norms of fathering roles and actions, what was expected of fathers, intimate partner violence. But a lot of the harms also kept a more narrow psychological focus and were. And let me sign. So we did find that a number of things were missing from the literature. So there wasn't really very much. I think there were 2 reviews that looked at intersecting oppressions against culturally and linguistically diverse minorities, against First Nations people, against LGBTQI plus people. And there was often not a specific focus on men's drinking and fathering or parenting. You know, alcohol was perceived as it was drinking without looking at whether that drinking was gendered, that was identified as problematic. So, as I think I'm summarising now, but there were direct and indirect outcomes for children, increased risks of anxiety and depression, and internalising and externalising behaviours included there. So, and there were, as we said, there were few findings in the literature specifically often about men and fathers and their drinking and how they affected children. And most of the literature was focused or from high-income countries. So I think we do need some more research about harms to children from men's drinking. I think we need to learn from people with lived experience to look at the precipitants of harm, look at the contexts, we need to separate the roles when we look at what's happening, and think about the mechanisms, and never forget that that there is context and intersections with other societal and structural problems play huge roles in why children are harmed and how and need to be addressed alongside the alcohol problems of men's drinking. So I think that's all I have, but thank you very much for listening, and happy to take questions during the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. You've just covered a wealth of research that has been carried out there, but at the same time pointing to I suppose the wealth of what we don't know as well, and I'd say very particularly in relation to children, which as you know is a very particular focus for us. So thank you so much on that. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, to Dr. Ingrid Wilson. So Ingrid is Associate Professor in Singapore Institute of Technology. She's a feminist researcher on gender-based violence, and her research has been exploring opportunities on how to reduce alcohol-related intimate partner violence, with a particular emphasis on the experiences of women survivors. She is a contributor, obviously, to this piece of research that we've just been talking about, but she's worked in many different capacities and has been providing advice in a number of areas, and also connected as well to La Trobe University in Australia, which is where Anne-Marie is based. And I think we have been talking earlier about those connections between Ireland and Australia. You know, there's things that where we see similar drinking patterns, but also where Australia has been doing things, maybe just been examining stuff of areas that we can be looking at as well. So Ingrid, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you, and I'll hand over now. Thank you.
Thank you. You can see my slides there?
That's coming up perfectly. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. Yes, thank you for the opportunity to share our research. So I'm particularly interested in the area of intimate partner violence, but ensuring that the voices of women and the experience is illuminated through research. So I'm a diehard qualitative researcher. But just to kind of just to confirm what we already know about from decades of evidence around alcohol's role in intimate partner violence. So without question, global studies will confirm that there is an association between intimate partner violence and harmful alcohol use. And we also know it increases the risk and likelihood of violence occurring. And we also know that it increases the severity of intimate partner violence, and in something that's kind of emerging as we're starting to look more closely at like homicide reviews. We're seeing too that alcohol plays a significant role in precipitating factor for fatal violence. What we also know is that there are higher rates of partner violence amongst clinical populations of men with substance use problems. So yes, where there is heavy alcohol use, as well as binge drinking patterns of drinking, we do have higher rates of intimate partner violence. And as Sheila highlighted, yes, this has been an area of tension where the notion of, does alcohol cause violence has been, widely contested, and concerns obviously around, excusing men's behaviour on the basis that they were drunk. So this question about accountability. I suppose where I sit is that we're talking about complex behaviours, and perhaps some of the debate and discussion needs to kind of move on beyond that notion of causation, where, as Sheila highlighted, this is a significant contributing risk factor that's well established in the evidence. Hence, recognising that, like we do recognise other risk factors such as, weapons, such as guns, we already know that we need to put in place measures to address and reduce the potency of these risk factors. So just one kind of fun fact I would say, and as a feminist researcher, I was surprised to learn this when I was doing my PhD, that in fact, women's actions against alcohol-related intimate partner violence really prompted the suffrage movement, where women were getting vocal about the incredible suffering they were experiencing, both from a violence perspective, but as well as economically, many centuries ago, that one of the few ways that they could actually take action was through getting some political empowerment. So that led to the temperance movement, etc. But certainly, just to kind of note that alcohol-related
domestic violence has always been a feminist issue. So one of the things that I mentioned that I'm quite keen to ensure is that the voices of survivors and, that the hidden voices do get heard. And so I just thought I would share a little bit about some of my research, which is very much focusing on, what does this experience look like? And then I'll touch on the review that actually contributed to the piece of work that Anne-Marie highlighted, the evidence review. So these are the three things I'm going to very briefly touch on. And just to also note a warning that I will be using quotes directly from lived experience. So just some of my research has been focused on really getting to the heart of what this experience is. And I recruited women through the question of, have you ever felt afraid when your partner was drinking? And that was on the basis that, women, rather than kind of establishing, have you experienced XYZ type of, violence, we all know our own sense of fear and experience. So this was about also empowering women to be the best judge of their experience. So with my interviews, I collated what the women told me and produced a kind of conceptual picture of what it is like to experience intimate partner violence, where alcohol is a feature of that. And so women talked about this kind of almost this very well-known stages of their partner's drinking. And so they often talked about when he started drinking, in fact, that it was quite a fun, sociable time, especially where they've got a partner who's may have some social anxiety or intimacy problems. So in a way, it was quite this ambivalent experience of, at the start of the drinking cycle, that it was actually quite fun. But then they also talked about how things would start to degenerate as he became more intoxicated. And so this kind of baiting and blaming, looking for a fight. And then also this move towards this kind of switch and highly aggressive stage, right through to becoming incapacitated and passing out, and to the point when the cycle ends when they're sober. But what's interesting is that the women talked about these stages in terms of which was safe and which ones were not safe. And here's an illustration from one of my participants who talked about this kind of staged cycle that where she would see, I suppose, different sides of their partner really, really emerge. And one thing that I suppose this kind of core experience that was central was this notion of where this cycle became a repeated pattern. And it wouldn't be every time that it would end up in abuse, but it happened enough that women would anticipate abuse every time he started drinking. So can you imagine, that sound of someone going to the fridge, opening a bottle, could be the trigger point for many women about, is it going to just, become an abusive environment this time? And so what I also did was map to this cycle what women talked about, the safety strategies that they used at particular stages. So they talked about doing everything that they could to prevent him from drinking, such as, disrupting routines. And I know one woman talked about dragging the whole family with their young children to go swimming 3 times a week, simply so that he would not just come straight home and start drinking. So women also talked about that vigilance when they're in occasions when he starts drinking, and would be counting the drinks and trying to kind of monitor, is it, has he moved with his drinking to the next stage? And also women talked about in this, especially in that kind of targeted, where he was looking for a fight stage, sometimes they argued back, which was also quite dangerous, they acknowledged. But then also they did talk about having to take this kind of tactically passive approach simply to de-escalate anything that was potentially going to happen. And we all know, you know, the drunk at the pub, you know, the minute you start kind of questioning or arguing, things can also become very, very volatile. So these are the things that women were doing within their own home. But then obviously when things were at their worst, women went basically down into lockdown and really tried to make sure that they kept themselves and their children safe. But an interesting thing that did come out with this research was that this safe stage they talked about when the partner was incapacitated and passed out, women had to switch to be the caregiver at that point. So often, despite having just previously experienced high rates of threat and violence, when he passed out, they had to go and basically make sure that he was okay. And another point too, when at the end of this cycle, women talked about having to kind of reintegrate and almost pretend things were back to normal after this cycle happened, especially when their partner either denied that the episode happened, there was silence, or even where there was the kind of gaslighting. So just to kind of highlight, this experience can be so challenging for women, how to navigate the safety and also keep their children protected. And we have published this in an open access journal. So, and just to highlight too that I also looked at how women described these relationships evolving, especially around, you know, when the navigating the drinking behaviour, as well as this cycle of violence. And women talked about, especially in a culture where we have drinking to excess that's celebrated, particularly by young men, that women can't see that there's any, you know, problematic drinking, especially when it's excessive drinking is so normalized. But women did talk about when they're in that established relationship that they can start to notice that there's problematic drinking, as well as that they can start to recognize that cycle being part of their, you know, a repeated pattern. And often in the questioning about his drinking, can also be quite dangerous for women. So they're kind of stuck in this situation of, well, you know, I know there's some problems here, but it puts me at risk to even question his drinking. And so often what you see is that women have to basically manage daily life around that cycle that I described just before. And often it's women who are the ones who are taking the steps to seek help for him, you know, try to get him to recognize as well that he has a problem. But ultimately also, for the women who are able to leave, often it's where they've also run out of hope that he will stop drinking, as well as obviously the abuse. But just to flag something that's also quite interesting, for women to, because we live in cultures where drinking is just part of our everyday existence, it's everywhere. For these women, being around people who are drinking is significantly the trigger for them. So even when they're able to, you know, achieve safety and leave these relationships, they find that they have to end up shrinking their world by avoiding environments where there is alcohol use, because also in future relationships, because that signals the trigger for them of the cycle that I just described before. And again, we've published this, and do contact me if you'd like a copy of this paper. But what we wanted to do was also to see, well, this experience, is it something that other studies have talked about? So part of the work that contributed to that evidence review was to do a review of qualitative research around the world, to really look at what is the experience of women across the world living with a partner with alcohol problems and experiences of violence. So one of the things that we found was that while we do know is quite established evidence around the risk to physical harm from men's drinking, what really came out was some other areas which we hadn't, as has not been well established in the quantitative literature. So certainly in these qualitative studies, women talked about the role of alcohol use in really heightening sexual aggression in their relationships. And I'll just leave you to read these quotes. Women also talked about, practically all of the studies that we looked at talked about how his drinking actually disempowers them economically, and how he prioritizes spending on his drinking, and women have to somehow make the household function economically. In addition, along the lines of what Anne-Marie talked about, because of his drinking, women are the ones who are also carrying the burden of the parenting and caregiving for children. But there's also this kind of other hidden impact where this kind of social isolation and stigma arising from his drinking does affect women significantly. And so what we did was we drew together into this kind of figure, not quite as pretty as what Anne-Marie had, but basically on similar lines. These are all the different types of alcohol-related actions that affect women that came out of our analysis of these reviews. But then the impacts on women that, again, we are really less studied, such as the mental health impact, the reproductive harm that women experience, the relationship, marital discord, and as well, women talked about, just this loss of intimacy with a partner who has alcohol problems, and as well the social harm. So importantly, because those who we study intimate partner violence, we know that social isolation is a significant risk factor for or kind of outcome for violence. Having a partner with an alcohol problem almost gives them this double stigma and isolation. And again, this paper is available, and I'll just quickly note that we're not really doing enough to include interventions that look at these outcomes around intimate partner violence, particularly in the alcohol space, as well as in the domestic violence space. This was a review I did in 2014. We did another review with the international colleagues almost 10 years later, and still find there's very little that has been done. And so just to sum up, so women are telling us that men's drinking does have a really insidious impact on their lives. And for some women, this alcohol and violence is intertwined. And so even just the fact of him even going to out drinking has that power that a raised stick would have, as Robin Room says. And so it really, I almost think we need to look at alcohol use as a weapon, like we do with firearms, that really it does affect women significantly, and even beyond the physical violence. But the thing is, with alcohol use, it is so women are fighting against this culture that really recognizes that men are entitled to drink, so their experiences of abuse are even more hidden. So I think where we need to go is that we need to actually engage with this complexity, take a gendered view, as Anne-Marie clearly pointed out. And by not addressing alcohol use within the context of intimate partner violence, we actually do risk gaslighting women. And as feminist researchers, we're all about believing women. So by not acknowledging when some women are telling us that, they feel more fearful when he drinks, we risk just, disregarding their voices. So we do need to include their voices also in the intervention design, where we all have a shared goal to reduce the potency of what we do know is a consistent risk factor. So thank you. So do reach out for copies of the papers if you need.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. I was very conscious as you were speaking when you were talking about binge drinking. We just saw a recent OECD report. Ireland has the second highest rate of binge drinking across OECD countries, and it points to, I suppose, just the normalisation of very heavy drinking here in Ireland, and it's so normalised. It's just a part of our everyday life, and obviously we're besieged with advertisements or whatever marketing to confirm that view of it. But it does make it difficult, I think, to really raise some of the issues, because you have to sort of take a step out of that and look back and say this isn't normal, even though it is normalized. It's actually not a normal thing. So very much appreciated what you were saying there, and indeed to be sharing those very, I don't have quite have the right words for it, but women's voices, and what was being said there is very painful to read, as I'm sure anybody who's working in this field would concur. So thank you indeed for that. I know actually just before we move on to the full part of our discussion, we wanted to have a little sort of a session with the two of you as our speakers on what you maybe saw as a framework for addressing this. So I'm not sure whether, Ingrid, you want to start with yourself or go back to Anne-Marie just on that particular element.
We'll hand it to Anne-Marie. Yeah,
I was hoping to just share the framework that came out of that third paper, and that also in the final review. So I'll share my screen again if you'll bear with me, and hopefully I can share the right one this time, but who knows. Yes?
Yes, perfect.
We've got third time lucky. So yeah, returning to the final review, which actually Ingrid touched on already, that the third review was aiming to review the existing literature on alcohol and the policy effects and how policy might impact and reduce the harms to women and children from men's drinking. And so we were looking for policies that we could strengthen. We're exploring policies that would best address or better address or best address these harms. But as Ingrid sort of already mentioned, that these reviews, there were 29 reviews that looked at the links between, tried to look at the links between policy and reductions in harm, but they were actually very scarce. There were very few reviews that actually did link policy with both alcohol consumption and societal harms to women and children. And there was little evidence that alcohol policy had improved outcomes for women and children. Part of that might have been because they weren't even measuring whether the harms were occurring to women and children. They continued to look at whether harms were occurring to men. So if we increase this alcohol policy or implement this, what happens? And most of the things that were happening were reducing harms to men if they were effective, but they weren't asking whether these harms were effective also on women and children. And gender was poorly reported, if at all. And the mechanisms of impact, so how was this reduction in alcohol policy effective at decreasing harm? It just sort of, there was this sort of simplistic relationship between it was all just related to reducing consumption, but that doesn't tell us enough about how reducing consumption might relate to improved outcomes for women and children. So we thought, well, we need a new model. There's not much out there. We need to sort of think through how we can understand alcohol policies and wider contexts. So we developed this model to look at alcohol policies related to men's drinking and harms from men's drinking, to advance policy. So the model considers the broader contextual determinants, so country level economic development, gender equality and inequality, religious and cultural contexts, and also neighbourhood or community supportive or anomic environments where there is the more things are out of control. We also looked at household moderators. They need to be included. What's the household composition? Is it crowded? What's the socioeconomic status? What are the gender roles within the household? And then we also looked at, how do each of these policies, and these household moderators, how can they affect drinking contexts? Do we push people to drink in the home if alcohol becomes more expensive in licensed premises? What happens if we how can we best change the drinking norms or beliefs around intoxication, men's right to become intoxicated if they wish, without regard to what the consequences might be? We also think about more general norms around masculinity and power and sexuality, and men's sexist ideas about what happens when they drink and what happens when, in a broader context in regard to their relationships with women and children. And so we figured that if we could work on those things, or simultaneously we then might get to look at the proximal issue that we see, because sometimes it seems to be that in combination with all of these other issues, when men drink and they are intoxicated, they are worse, they're more harmful, their violence is more severe, and it becomes more common. So how can we make those links? And then, I guess in turn, by influencing men's drinking, reduce harms to women and children. And I mean, there's a range of different harms. There's many different harms. Some will be more connected to the drinking than others. And of course, many of these harms will continue without drinking if men don't change in other ways, or society and doesn't change in other ways. But perhaps we can think through, particularly where making changes to alcohol consumption and the ways that men drink might make the most difference. So Ingrid talked a little bit about almost coercive control, where whether someone is drinking, or whether a man's drinking then does kind of lead to additional controls around the woman's behaviour. Sorry, I haven't explained that very well. But yeah, so I think and returning to children, I think we need to think carefully about that we don't forget the child's voice in this, because it's easier. Women, children also need stronger voices, need more autonomy. They have their own ways of viewing the world that we need to take into account when we think about what they need and how they would like their lives and their worlds and their communities to be, where they do feel safe. And sometimes that might mean when people don't act strangely, when they don't do things that they wouldn't normally do if they weren't drinking. So that was the sort of the results from the final paper. But all in the global briefing, we bring together all of those 3 papers, and we produced 2 beautiful graphs. Personally, I like the purple and green more than the blue and pink, but that's my my issue. And this here in this RTA paper, we summarise the actions of drinking men and their impacts on children and women, and describe how the actions of men and their drinking might be moderated by these household level, society level, community and cultural factors, and that may impact the actions on the alcohol affected man, which might then, lead to reductions in harms to women and children. And this is in the final paper. That's a somewhat simplified model of a slightly simplified model, the same model really, of the one that I just went through. So, I mean, one thing I'd say, we recently put a piece in the conversation that kind of summarises the work that we did, and we do argue that we think it's important that the gender violence plans should include alcohol in them, and we're arguing for that in Australia. And this is a plug, I shouldn't do this, but I've just recently released our most recent report on alcohol's harm to others in Parliament yesterday. So if you've got time, it's also worth a read, I think. And that's the end though. So I will go back to this slide. Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. And I actually spotted that on the paper that was launched yesterday in the policy brief. I saw that actually came from FAIR as well on that. So, and there was a lot of very useful steers within that. I was very struck, actually, just one thing that was mentioned, about the absence of data collection, and sadly in Ireland that is a feature of a lot of issues around alcohol, that we don't collect enough sustained proper collation of data, so that if you do make an intervention somewhere, can you measure what's actually happening? Can you see, is there something there? I mean, even something as basic as ED presentations, alcohol-related ED presentations, are not monitored as standard. You just get snapshots from then and now, whereas, we actually often talk about this, that the ED is a place where many interventions could be being made anyway. So just as a particular thing would say, if somebody presents to an ED in an intoxicated state, maybe with a fall or an injury in that kind of a way, we would be saying there's an opportunity here to ask the question, are there children involved? Is there a child at home? Is this person going back home with an injury but in an intoxicated state? What's the story with children? There are other interventions, just places like that where you could be doing, some things at least monitoring and measuring would help to inform some of the policy. So, and maybe just at this point open ourselves back out to to our panel, and I'd like to thank them so much for joining us today. Anne-Marie, maybe I'll just suggest if you were able to stop sharing, if that was okay. Thank you, and indeed. So we're joined on our panel today, and we have some questions I see also coming into our discussion, but just to go back to the panel in the first instance, and thank you again for coming in. Alison, I'm just wondering, from your perspective, just your own reaction to what you've been listening to, and your perspective of, working with women and working in domestic violence, how much of that gelled with you, or questions or whatever else, or just your own response to that.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to join here today, Sheila, and for the presentations. They were very interesting. I suppose from our own experience, like our services here have been operating almost 20 years, and as has been mentioned, I suppose I'd like to preface by saying, obviously the use of alcohol or any substance, it's never a mitigating factor for why men use violence in relationships. I suppose it's around the whole inequality of power and the abuse of that power and control. I suppose it is well documented that alcohol, it can most definitely be a contributing risk factor for many societal issues, and I suppose it also can have harmful outcomes for many people, including women and children, for a variety of reasons. I suppose the poor reporting on gender was interesting to hear in the reports there, and I suppose that's a real key point around, especially in our theorizing here and our experience in terms of domestic violence being a gender-based abuse. It's crucial that gender reporting is happening in a greater extent, to make sure that it's clear that, women and children living in abuse, that alcohol may be involved in some of those families. For many we see coming through, it's not, but for those that it is involved in, that it can most definitely be a factor in escalating, let's say, the severity or the ferocity of the attacks. I suppose we would have women reporting to us that, when there's been like a binge, or there's been a increased consumption of alcohol by the perpetrator, that there most definitely can be an escalation in the violence, or a move to physical violence that maybe isn't seen so much without the alcohol. But I suppose, it's just making that point as well, that it can never be used as an excuse for why violence is happening. We have lots of families coming in where there is no alcohol, but I suppose just to mention that piece is really crucial. And I suppose that gender reporting was interesting to hear, that stuck out for me in the reports.
Absolutely. Thank you indeed. Michelle, I wonder if I could just, go to you. You work in this very difficult area. So all of this is difficult, but I think, your work in working with perpetrators, and I just wondered your own response and, what you see in your practice and, in the work of Move Ireland in this space.
Thanks, Sheila. Firstly, I'd actually really like to thank the two presenters. I suppose it was very, very affirming for me, was actually what I felt. I would really agree with Alison. I mean, we never look as alcohol as an excuse for violence, but it definitely is an accelerant. Absolutely is an accelerant. And for me, our work in Move Ireland is predominantly around the safety and protection of women and children. And I suppose that the whole issue around alcohol and gender-based violence, it definitely can't be looked at in isolation. But it is, it is certainly something that there is a gender base on, and, it really has to be taken into consideration. And for us, sorry, I'm slightly distracted by the telephone. For us, I suppose, even just looking at our latest stats and what we see on the ground, like 48% of men that present in our programs, at screening, they're presenting with drug and alcohol issues. We often have to close cases where we're screening people to get access to programs because of their drug and alcohol misuse. We often see, that then even when we get people into program, repeated pattern that you highlighted is something that we see so many times. It's like somebody will come into a program and it's like, I've given up the drink and I've given up taking drugs and I'm really going to engage now with this program. But then the cycle kicks in and they drop out and their behavior might become so chaotic that they can't actually engage in the behavior change. So they end up being exited from the program. So we see so many of the issues that you highlighted around drugs and alcohol and the significant barriers that they create in terms of men engaging in the work that they, and like when you look at it, 53% of our referrals year on year. In the last 2 years, we've had a 91% increase in referrals of men seeking help, which is brilliant. But then 53% of those are self-referrals. So that also speaks to men realize that they have a problem. They want to change their abusive behavior. But then 48% of those are having problems with drugs and alcohol. So it really speaks to what can we do or how do we go at that to really, because alcohol is a significant issue in behavior change problem interventions.
Absolutely, and I know one of the things that we've been talking about is about trying to, I suppose, join the dots a bit more between different services, between the, maybe who are working in the alcohol sphere, those who are working with, like yourselves with men, but where can we pull this together a little bit better? And maybe, Ailbhe, if I just sort of turn to you in this place, one of the things that we have been saying in Alcohol Action is that in a strategy to deal with domestic violence, we would like to see alcohol being named as a factor, as a contributing thing. More so, I think, because we want to be able to say, well, if it's a contributing factor, if it's a risk factor, well then how can we join the dots together in these things? And I just wondered, from your own perspective, you have a long history of campaigning on different issues. Have you any particular thoughts or on how we can confront what is an uncomfortable issue?
Well, first of all, a big thank you to Anne-Marie and to Ingrid for really research which I think is incredibly important and which I think also needs to be widely circulated here in Ireland, not least to our legislators and policymakers. But I mean, it is a difficult issue to tackle, but what bothers me or what really concerns me is that in a country where heavy drinking is very marked. We have very high levels of heavy drinking, relatively speaking. Why is it so difficult, and why is it so uncomfortable for us to talk about this? It's as if that male entitlement to drink as much as they wish is a kind of freedom that we grant to men. And I actually think that we really have to push back against this. We have to look at what the research is telling us, what the experience of people like Allison and Michelle is telling us throughout the country, that this is a major problem for women, and it is a major problem so often unspoken for children. So I think what we have to do is actually try to create a national conversation about the impacts of heavy drinking on intimate personal relationships and on families. And I think we really need to do that now. We will have a new strategy for DGSV coming up very shortly in 2026. I think it's really important for us to do everything we can to encourage that conversation now. I'm very, very, very struck by the point which I think Ingrid made, which is that, of course, alcohol is and can be, and particularly heavy drinking, can be used by men as in itself a tool, a weapon to keep women in a situation of disempowerment and inequality, to frighten them, to terrify them, to give them extra stress and burdens. And that brings us to the point that while alcohol is, of course, not the root cause of violence, it is a hugely important factor in actually enabling that and in what happens. So I think this is very timely, Sheila. I am extremely pleased from the point of view of children that we really are talking about these impacts, and we need to spread that word even further.
Absolutely. Thank you indeed. I know, one of the reasons that we see that it can be difficult to talk about alcohol, regardless of whether we're talking about violence or not, is that we have a huge amount of saturation alcohol marketing that tells us that alcohol is a risk-free product essential to everyday life. And that does, it affects all of us, not whether we're necessarily drinking or not, but it certainly can affect us in policy making, because we all absorb that message. Even we may say that we're immune to it, but when you see images that portray it as being a part of normal family life, which is what we see as being part of sporting occasions, music, whatever's the interest, it's hard to then be able to say, well, actually, there's an awful lot of harm that's coming from this product. So I do feel that that's an element that's in this mix, but why it can be difficult to look at it. We have some questions just coming up, and just invite anybody to put anything into the chat. That I hope I'm probably not doing this in order, but just as I see here, we have a question asking. Sorry, just go back up to the top again. Are we seeing this type of behaviour creeping in with younger men, boys? Any comments from anybody on this?
I suppose definitely from our point of view, we would see this type of behaviour in the, like, we start working with men from when they're 18, predominantly it's early 20s to early 30s would be the largest cohort of men that we would have on programs, and absolutely, as I said, 48% alcohol is tobacco.
Yeah, and indeed there was a question as well, do Move work with men who are experiencing problematic drug or alcohol use?
That really is depending on how problematic that issue is. If it's something that can be managed, yes, but generally if it's very, very chaotic and they're not able to engage, we will refer them to services. Indeed, a lot of our clients will come from probation services as well, where they'll be linked in drug and alcohol services if they need them. But obviously you need somebody stable. It's like anything, they're entering into our program as a behaviour change intervention. It's a long, long program. It takes nearly a year to go through the program, and it really is tearing apart all of that gender conditioning and social norms that has brought somebody to where they are now. So we have a duty of care to everybody. So realistically, we need to make sure that the person is in a position where they can engage in that work. So if there's chaotic drug and alcohol issues or mental health issues, then we have to factor that into the best decision for the person at the time.
Alison, I see your hand up there as well.
Yeah, just in response to the question about young men and boys, I suppose, yeah, there's huge concerns around our upcoming generations of young men and boys and lots of their learnings and moldings, whether it be the use of alcohol, as we're talking about obviously today, the use of pornography, just their general understanding of relationships, what's healthy, what's unhealthy. I suppose we would do work with secondary schools, particularly kind of transition year up at the moment around that piece and identifying that. And I suppose it is a huge concern that we have a generation of young men and boys that are growing up and having this, I suppose, seriously distorted view of what's right in terms of gender understanding, but also how women and men treat each other, how relationships and what is healthy and what is not healthy. And absolutely, I suppose the long history that we have in Ireland with drink can't be forgotten about here in terms of how quite often, yeah, it's just seen as the norm, it's just seen as a tradition, and problematic drinking is not seen as problematic. And also, I suppose, you know, in terms of how it impacts children and the whole piece around adverse childhood experiences, whether it be DV or alcohol, I suppose we can't speak about that enough in terms of the harm down the road for generations to come if we're not addressing all of this now. Yeah.
Couldn't agree with you more. I mean, just you know, what we're doing today, the children of today, and the legacy that they will carry and their own experiences are just incredibly important.
I'll just add to that point, Alison, because you know you're so right. Like we started to track the adverse childhood and community experiences of the men in our program, and even at that, like average men in our program are coming with an average. Well, they're coming with an average of 12 ACEs, and one of those huge ones is growing up with substance abuse as well. So like there's that huge intergenerational link that we can't ignore.
Ingrid, I see your hand up there as well too. And actually, sorry, Anne-Marie's hand too, but maybe we'll go to Ingrid first of all. I think I saw it there first of all.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to those points from Alison and Michelle that because also where alcohol is a coping mechanism, and what's really you know, complicated for like the women talked about how, you know, they could see him using alcohol as a coping mechanism, not in any way, you know, the women did not excuse his violence or diminish his need for accountability. But one of the complicating things for these women in these relationships is that they wanted to seek help for him to ease his pain, but often the partner was very resistant to seeking help for himself. So there's this complicating element to these relationships, which also make it very difficult for women to, I suppose, ultimately to leave. So, yeah.
Anne-Marie? Yeah, there.
I'm already unmuted. So, yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about. I think Gail Gilchrist, I think, has done some really important work on working with men who use alcohol and other drugs, and working with them to target their the violence that they might use. So I think that's an equally advanced program that I think, you know, combines gendered understandings of what's happening with reduction, trying to reduce alcohol and other drug problems. So I think that can be helpful. It's interesting in Australia too. I mean, on the one hand, we do have a little bit of positive news. Like there's a survey called 10 to Men, and it looks at masculinity among young boys aged 10 to men. And, some of their attitudes are improving. And I think, attitudes amongst fathers generally, I think men are co-parenting better than they may have ever done. And I think you can also sometimes see that men are reducing their drinking as well, and perhaps so I think, yet I guess there's also this understanding that where there is that culture of heavy drinking, that we've also done some other work that shows that men don't have, if they're involved in that, if they're spending time in this sort of masculine heavy drinking environment, they're not there for their children, so they're less involved in fathering, and that sets up the next generation. And also, I guess these men in that was the United Nations multi-country study of men and violence. Those men also did have significant histories of trauma themselves. So, and I think alcohol is not very kind to men as well, because they're also hurting each other and hurting themselves. So I think there's not that and I don't think it. I'll stop there. But thanks. Yeah.
Ailbhe, your hand's up too.
Well, I would personally like to see us also being in a position to do some more work, some more research on children's experiences in these situations. Children, perhaps as they grow up and reflect back on or young adults as they reflect back on their childhood, because I do think that's a really important point. It comes up in the research that children's voices are simply not heard in this, so that we focus on men, and we very rightly focus on women, of course, but we're absolutely not focusing on children, and we really, really, really need to do that. And I think that would move the dial on how we think about this whole situation. So I hope that's, a potential outcome from the work that Alcohol Action Ireland is doing, actually.
Yeah, we do collate stories actually on our Shared Voices platform, and these are adults who are sharing their childhood experiences, and we've done some research on looking at that. Bernardo's have done some fantastic work on trying to get children's voices into this space. But there is a need for a lot more in this. I have a question here, I think actually to Ingrid and Anne-Marie, which is about anything that would be happening in Australia that we should be. Sorry, I lost the question. It was way up there. My apologies, like that. But I think basically, the question is, has the topic been part of a public health communications campaign or anything else that you might like to say that might be happening?
I mean, not so much public health communications campaign. Certainly, it's in the spotlight with the policymakers at the moment in Australia. So there is calls for getting the liquor laws, the state liquor laws, to actually recognise this as an issue. So there's that momentum. But as such, I suppose we're not really. Emery, are we seeing any public health campaigns that specifically talk about this yet?
I think, so there's an NGO, the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education, and they've recently released a position paper, I think, that does with Anne Rose, which is one of the key Australian National Research on Women's Society. I think that's the acronym. But there's been a tradition where there hasn't been as much connection between some of our and the alcohol, but FARE have really sought to try and get alcohol included in the national plan against violence against women. And I think it is. I mean, it is there as So I think there is whether that's a campaign, a public campaign, I don't. Yeah, I think it's sort of more of a research translation, sort of a policy action, sort of implementation plan that some of the NGOs working together are trying to sort of to sort of work in the corridors of power to kind of influence a policy. But what that policy might be, I'm not sure. So, for example, I guess at the state level, it might be around home deliveries. So people can be intoxicated and they can still ring up and get more alcohol any time of the night or day. So they're trying to decrease that access to alcohol that way. That might fuel or increase the risk of violence within homes, I guess. And there's some lived experience advocates that are also talking about how alcohol within the home has affected them as a child, and also as a partner. So I don't know. I think, maybe.
Definitely very interesting to hear. In Ireland, there is a big push to increase licensing hours, and indeed one of the ways in which we became, when this sort of came to our attention, or something that we wanted to say in relation to that, was because of that push to increase licensing hours, and us and many others, about 80 different organisations, would have called for a health impact assessment of those proposals, and because there's many aspects to it, but just if we were saying specifically around domestic violence, there was an interesting piece of research that had come up from New South Wales, where there had been actually a decrease, restriction in late night trading, that then research showed that there had been a 29% reduction in reports of domestic violence. And it was an interesting thing for us, when we were in this space. As I say, the increase in licensing hours would affect many elements of alcohol harm, but that was just one particular one. Alison, sorry, your hand's up there.
Yeah, just when you mentioned that, actually, Sheila, it just triggers something else in my mind in terms of I suppose there's a reference in the framework there around, I think it's something like controlling behaviour is more likely, possibly when a man is intoxicated. I suppose, as I mentioned earlier, like obviously coercive control happens in every violent relationship. But I suppose in relation to the alcohol piece, like I suppose we would have heard from women that sometimes, suppose, they feel that they have a little bit more ability to, let's say, try and pacify the perpetrator. The piece around women feeling that, the pacification in terms of trying to, I suppose, de-escalate what's going on, but they feel that at times they may be able to pacify slightly more when he's not intoxicated. So that's just a point to make there as well, that obviously control happens in all violent relationships, but the pacifying where women feel that when he's possibly out of control after taking a substance, it can be the most dangerous time. But I suppose it's just your comment there that came to my mind around that piece.
Thank you indeed. I see, firstly, just to everybody, this is being recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel afterwards, and we'll also circulate to anybody who registered for the event. I see a question here, somebody who's talking about, whose works in relation to supporting women in commercial sexual exploitation. And I'm just reading the whole question out. And while there's very little research that I've come across on this, I think the dynamics of alcohol use by sex buyers has many of the same effects, including increased violence and lower tolerance for condom use. Would love to know if the panelists have any views on this. So, always when it's so interesting because there's many different aspects, but I'll just ask, has anybody got a response to that? And maybe not.
I'll jump in. Just when we did our qualitative review, yes, we had our kind of inclusion criteria about it being intimate relationships, but we did come across, I think, one or two studies that did. It was in that more commercial sex work relationships, and yes, exactly what was said there. That they felt that alcohol use contributed to, well, yes, not only kind of more escalated violence, but also, unwillingness to use contraception. And in fact, that was kind of common across, the intimate relationships, just generally. But one of the things is that, we just never hear from, research is very difficult to do, but also often they're not the population that are being subject to research. And I think it's really negligent of us that we haven't researched this more. Yeah.
Thank you. And I see a comment as well from Clara. At a local micro level, we're seeing a significant absence of fathers / positive male role models for children, young men, which I believe is contributing to the behaviour and understanding of relationships for young men growing up. Thank you, Clara, for that comment. I see that somebody in the audience has their hand up. I can't just easily go to the audience to ask you to contribute in this way, but if you can put any questions into the chat, that'll hopefully work out on that.
And sorry, Sheila, can I just, that last question about the commercial sex working, I suppose obviously it's also a known fact that quite often in relationships, in terms of intimate relationships, the women become involved and coerced into being involved in sex work by their partner. So I suppose it's just important to consider that factor as well, because sometimes there's a distinction made between women in sex work as opposed to women that are in relationships that are being forced into sex work by their partner. So yeah, just to make sure we keep that in our mind as well, that there's women in sex work in lots of different situations, but in a domestic violence situation where they're being coerced into it, just to remember that piece as well.
Absolutely. And I'm also aware, and this is a different topic, but just, from stories that have been shared with us, that for children in homes where there's alcohol harm, that sadly actually also sexual abuse of children can really be a feature there as well. And we certainly would know from some stories that have been shared with us about children essentially being trafficked out to others. So just there's some very grim stories, much more. Yeah.
Sorry, just to add to that, what also came out in the studies that were reviewed, particularly in lower income countries, where this the economic disempowerment and around the partner's alcohol use, and we were focusing on the alcohol in these studies, but that also contributed to women's economic disempowerment. So then meant that they then had to seek other forms of income, one of which was sex work as well, which was very dangerous in some of these countries. So it's just this kind of vicious cycle of all of the kind of exploitation, the abuse, as well as alcohol within that mix. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I feel that we've opened a conversation. I'm very happy that we were able to do this. We're just coming up to our hard stop of 11:30, so I want to just draw it to a close at the moment. I so much want to thank our presenters today. Thank you so much to Anne-Marie Laslett and Ingrid Wilson. Fabulous. You're just wonderful, and you can see there's a lot of very nice comments actually in the chat, just appreciating your time and your effort in joining us and what you presented on. Huge thanks to our three panelists, to Alison, to Michelle and to Ailbhe. We've been throwing in and batting in questions that are there, and I appreciate that you bring in that wealth of knowledge and understanding, and I suppose the complexity of what we're doing, is illustrated so well by your experiences and your work that has been in that. So thank you so much to all. And I just want to wish everybody, a good weekend coming up. I know this is a grim topic. We did put some resources into the materials. So just be good to yourself over the next wee while. And thank you again for joining us. Bye now.